Welcome, welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and downloading another episode of Wigs for Wigs. I'm your host, Joe Cook, and today we have an exciting episode. I'm going to be joined by both Bill Venezia and Frank McGady, my typical co hosts from Hudson Catholic High School in Jersey City. And we're also going to be welcoming in an outside guest, an old friend of mine from college, Leo Vaccaro, will be joining us. Leo is a history teacher at St. Joe's Prep down in Philadelphia. So we're kind of seeing how many Catholic school educators we can gather together to have one historical discussion here. But Leo is going to be talking to us both about his work as a history teacher, some of his interests. We do go back to being floor mates on our freshman year at Gettysburg College. So we have a lot of Civil War connection that we'll be talking about a little bit. But specifically, Leo is going to be joining us to talk about his involvement with a citizens organization project in Philadelphia, where they are trying to change the name of a street in that city. There is a street in Philadelphia named for the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1830s to 1860s, a man named Roger Taney. Roger Taney was appointed to the Supreme Court by Andrew Jackson. He was the first Catholic, ashamedly so for all of us Catholic educators who are going to be on this chat, to ever serve on the Supreme Court. But he is most notorious for his involvement as a leading, for his leading role in the Supreme Court case involving Dred Scott, where he wrote the opinion of the court. He tried to sway the court to be unanimous, which it wound up not being, in its ruling against Dred Scott, in upholding the legality of slavery. So Roger Taney has a very problematic role in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. There are other issues also in his career that are problematic. And so Leo's going to be joining us to talk about why they're trying to change this street name in Philadelphia, and also how they're going about this and what the future might hold for changing this name. And we'll talk more broadly about historical memory of Taney and other historical figures of that time period. So stick around. I will be right back after this ad, and I'll be joined by Bill Venezia, Frank McGady, and Leo Vaccaro. Stick around, everybody. All right, we are back here on Wigs for Wigs, and I'm joined by Bill Venezia, Frank McGady, both from Hudson Catholic, and by Leo Vaccaro from St. Joe's Prep down in Philly. We're seeing how many Catholic educators we can gather together to try to remove the name of a prominent Catholic from a street in Philadelphia. So, Leo, welcome. Your first time here on Wigs for Wigs. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Roger Taney, with Taney Street down there in Philadelphia, and why we're trying to change this name?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. So I actually live right next to Taney Street, and here in Philadelphia, we have a very funny accent. So absolutely everyone in Philadelphia calls it Taney Street. And one day we were knocking on doors. So we've had a long process now of knocking on every door on the street. And one of the times that I did that, I was actually joined by a member of the Taney family, Joy Taney, who lives in West Philadelphia, who showed up and said, yeah, Philadelphians can call the street whatever they want, but just make sure that you call me Taney, because that is actually my family's name. And they're all for changing the street name. They do not want the street to be named after their ancestor anymore. And it was actually really interesting to see that Joy talking to people on the street and saying like, oh yeah, this is actually my family that it's named for, and we do not want it named this anymore because it's such a terrible name to have. It's such a terrible connection to have. And there's one thing I did want to say, since this is a history podcast in particular, and it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, because there have been a number of newspaper and news hits about this story that have started off with, oh, the street is allegedly named, or no one can say for sure, but the street seems to be named after Roger Taney. And last year, I went to a few different archives in Philadelphia. I went to the city archive. I pulled out all of the records for city council at the Free Library of Philadelphia, which was incredibly helpful, by the way. The librarian there just knew where absolutely everything was from 1858, all of the 1858 files of Philadelphia. And I went to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and there's the burden of proof to say that it's not named after Roger Taney is so outrageously high, because what happened in the 1850s is that Philadelphia consolidated, like a lot of other cities in the 19th century. And it was a long, messy process, and they renamed I tried to count it, and as far as I could tell, they renamed 971 streets in Philadelphia in one ordinance in 1858. And I looked at the names in those streets, and some of them were super obvious, but a lot of them were just named after political people of that generation, of that era. And
right. So who else could Taney be but Roger Taney?
Exactly. So then I went and tried to find anyone with that name who was even living in Philadelphia in 1858. I tried to find anyone that that could be a contender for it not being Roger Taney. But if you look at the newspapers in 1858, which I did, you look at I looked at everyone who signed the ordinance, and I tried to figure out, well, were they supporters of Roger Taney? And they were. As it turned out, there were a lot of people who wanted to take Roger Taney's perspective on the Civil War and Roger Taney's reading of citizenship. And it's terrible. And that's the reality that we lived in. So even though, since they changed 971 street names, I understand that there wasn't a celebration for every one of them, but it is so very, very obvious. And it's a job of a historian. I really do think a historian can prove that, yes, it is named after Roger Taney, even though you will never find like a parade that they had that day celebrating that it was Roger Taney, because they only had 365 days in a year, and they changed 971 street names. So anyway, I'm sorry. I just wanted to get that off my chest quickly. In this is a history.
I appreciate that. I'm sure you brought up, I'm wearing a Civil War Institute shirt where Leo and I worked together in college for Dr. Gabor Boyd, and I'm sure he would be very appreciative of you working harder to find all that information.
Yeah, looking all the way through it. But anyway, I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that I think people forget how big of a deal the Dred Scott decision actually turned out to be. I don't think it necessarily was a immediate. I know there's speculation that it wasn't an immediate realization, but once Lincoln started pushing the envelope and explaining to voters the implications that the country can't remain half slave and half free because slaveholders could just bring their laborers anywhere and no one could effectively do anything about it, and there was no due process. And Philadelphia had a huge, successful, powerful, important African-American population that built the first HBCU, which is now Cheney University, and had some powerful churches with some of the first like Black ministers, people who were actually ordained in the country. And that's all an obvious problem to everybody in 1857 after the decision, and then they named the street after him, 1858, the Lincoln Douglas debates, people were reading in the newspaper. So I wish that people had a better understanding that it wasn't just some old white dead guy that said something bad, that it was actually like a literal crisis that caused the Civil War, and that then a whole generation of Americans sacrificed in order to change. And a whole generation of Americans went out there and died and fought to get the 14th Amendment to overturn the Dred Scott decision. So
Yeah, I think we should. I know it's facetious, but I think we should point that out that the Dred Scott decision is not any longer the law of the land in the United
yeah,
States.
yeah,
Mike Huckabee in 2016 said many people don't realize that the Dred Scott decision is still the law of the land in
oh
the
no,
U.S. And,
Well,
no.
did the Emancipation Proclamation that was January 1st, 1863, did that effectively end the Dred Scott decision?
not quite.
No.
No, I don't think so, because it's a citizenship problem too. It's not just because
I
what
would
he
think the
says.
15th Amendment would have solved that, right? Wouldn't the 15th Amendment have solved that?
The
The
15th,
14th and 15th. Yeah.
Yeah.
14th? Well, 14th was the one with citizenship. 15th
Yes.
was, that's 14th Amendment.
Yeah, regardless of any prior status of servitude. I'm trying to remember the exact wording of the 14th Amendment, but anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. So, Frank, I'm just going to throw it to you for a moment here, Frank, as a fellow history teacher like me and Leo. Could you talk a little bit about the significance of the Dred Scott decision?
I've actually had the distinction of actually visiting his home. He obviously wasn't home, but I did take a tour, and it's amazing how, it's just like when I went to James Buchanan's house in Lancaster, how the tour guides kind of twisted themselves to kind of elevate
Make them seem better people.
Yeah, Buchanan really wasn't a bad president. He did, and then Taney, a lot of people misunderstand him, and I'm like, I remember being with my wife, and I'm like, didn't want to say anything in front of the tour guys, but after I said, no, I don't think we're misunderstanding him at all. And I even got an email once from because I signed my name, and I had written something in an email from a relative saying that his reputation has been besmirched and so on. But I did notice that his statue that used to be in front of the State House in Annapolis, Maryland, is now gone. So the people of Maryland realized that we do not want to commemorate Roger Taney. So
And
hopefully,
the Capitol also just removed a bunch.
Right.
yeah.
That started in 220. Unfortunately, wasn't affected until 222. I mean, it's in the former Supreme Court offices, and it should be relegated to museum status, but
yeah, it's hard to when you have something like if they're going to do something on all the Supreme Court justices, it's I mean, they could do something like they did at West Point with Benedict Arnold, and just have a plaque with no name on it, just his rank. But that would be, Chief Justice, and then leave it blank. But yeah, I don't know. Tony actually had also the distinction of swearing in Abraham Lincoln, right? For his first inauguration. Not the second one. Was he dead by then?
No, he was dead by the second one.
Yeah,
Salmon
he was
Chase
dead
had
by the
taken
second
over by
one.
the second one.
Right. So yeah, it did have a major significance. I know Buchanan tried to get it to be passed by kind of twisting I think one arm.
He really wanted to make it unanimous, and two judges still wrote dissents, Judge Curtis and Judge drawing a blank on the other one's name. But
yeah.
did they resign? I thought they resigned even too. Is that correct? I believe that they were there were at least one, if not two members of the court were so annoyed by the dictum in the decision that they actually removed themselves.
Oh, I didn't know that. But that's actually, I like to hear that.
Yeah.
Amazing that.
yes, you're right. Judge Curtis resigned.
Yes, I do remember that. Yep.
I can't remember the other one's name, but I know his name. And he resigned from the court. As a result, he was so disgusted. So,
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the neighborhood where Taney Street is, and just a little bit about the actions that your citizens organization is taking, and where this project stands of trying to get that name off of the street.
Yeah.
And then also a little bit about Caroline LeCount, who you had.
Definitely. I'd love to. So there's been talk for a while now about removing the name Taney, and it's a relatively small street that runs parallel to the numbered streets in Philadelphia, and it appears and disappears in different neighborhoods. So it actually goes across 3 different council districts in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia politically is organized in sort of an old-fashioned way, that there's 17 different council people, and that sort of means that there's kind of 17 different mayors in Philadelphia. And so the conclusion to all of this, and I'll tell you some details about what it's looked like, is that City Council has the complete and total authority to change the street name, because the street doesn't even go outside of the city of Philadelphia. And so if it went somewhere else in Pennsylvania, then it could be something that Harrisburg would be interested or not interested in taking up. But so City Council is the group that tomorrow could just write a bill if they wanted to, and it would be a 1-line bill, and that would change everything. So so that's the group that we've mostly been lobbying, and we worked with closely with one of those council members who gave us a process of what he wanted us to do in order to prove that the residents actually do want the street name changed. And so we have knocked on doors on the street multiple times. And I just want to, as a little caveat, there are really only a handful of people that have said that they don't want the street name changed. And I mean, we're talking like less than 5 people, as far as I remember and can recall, on the actual street itself. And then out of like the various surveys that we've had back, we've been seeing consistently around 90% of people saying like, we actually do want it changed. So in my estimation, that's not even just a majority. It doesn't, there's not really any organized, there's definitely no organized resistance, and there's really not any resistance to it being changed, except for a very small minority of voices. And some of them have sent us letters saying, like, I'm thinking one letter in particular that said, I don't even know what the history is. I don't even care what the history is. So, I mean, that's kind of like the level that the debate, there's really not people showing up and rallying support for Roger Taney because it's just so odious. And that's where we're at in terms of what people think. Now, it's hard to convince politicians, obviously, to do something that when they don't have to do anything, you know, and it's hard to convince people to make the change when it's not a bread and butter issue or something like that. So we've had a lot of different events and a lot of different community engagement. We've reached out to every community organization that deals with the neighborhood through which Taney Street runs. And we're talking about multiple neighborhoods here. So we have endorsement letters from all those groups. You can go onto our website, Rename Taney, and see all of the letters of support, see all the different campaigns that we've had, see all the different op-eds, see all the times that we've had earned media reports. So it's really been like a long, robust program with a team full of people. And I need to be conscious that, you know, I'm a white Catholic school teacher guy. And so I'm not the only person on this project. You know, it's a diverse coalition. It really is a diverse group of people. And yeah, so that's basically where we are with the campaign.
So you guys had this poll to choose who you would want to rename the street for. There were a number of prominent Philadelphians in the poll. I actually went and voted on it. I voted for Octavius Cato.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's actually his fiance, Caroline LeCount, who won the poll. So tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really exciting turning point for the project that happened about a year ago. Eventually I got really sick of trying to talk about how terrible Roger Taney really was to everybody. And so it was nice to be able to talk about somebody that actually is worthy of being honored. And that would be Caroline LeCount. Caroline LeCount was born near where, if you're familiar with Philadelphia, she was born at 9th and Rodman, which is near where there's a big Whole Foods these days on South Street. And she was born in a neighborhood that was predominantly African American at the time. And her father was a cabinet maker, as well as having family connections to undertakers for African Americans. And the story is that her father actually would hide runaway African American enslaved laborers in coffins and actually help bring them into the North. And she turned out to be a very smart, very good student. She went to the Institute for Colored Youth and graduated in 1863. And that was a really rigorous humanistic program of study with a public oral exam, the results of which would be published in the newspaper. And so she's learning ancient
We should
Greek.
do that with our
math,
students.
It's incredible. It's incredible. You can look up the tests online too, or you can even go to the microfilm if you want to do and see what the exams looked like. And she ended up being an educator. She was first a teacher and then a principal for decades. But she did fall in love with Octavius Cato and was engaged to be married to him. He was assassinated in 1871 on Election Day, which in Philadelphia in those days used to be in October. And she never remarried, but she's most famous because in March of 1867, so I have a streetcar behind me in I guess you can't see it if you listen to the podcast.
Yes,
but
you're listening to
you
the
can look up
podcast, you can't see, but he does have a old streetcar behind him on his
as my background here. But there had been a long campaign with Octavius Cato, with Caroline LeCount, with this other guy, William Still, who's the father of the Underground Railroad.
Yes, very important, the Underground Railroad. I was going to bring him up
and
later.
A historian too. He actually tracked everybody who escaped enslavement through Philadelphia in his notebooks. I've been able to see those notebooks. They're absolutely incredible piece of cultural historical heritage that we have here. And they had been lobbying for years that the streetcar system, the public transit precursor to the trolley system, should be integrated. And there were real wartime reasons it should be mentioned that once African Americans enlisted in the Army, which Pennsylvania's Governor Andrew Curtin dragged his feet a little bit to make that happen. But once it happened, there was a big training camp that was set up on the northern border of the city in Lamont, Pennsylvania, or Cheltenham, Pennsylvania. And therefore, there was a lot of traveling back and forth between where most people lived in what we would now maybe call Old City or Center City, up to that location. And if any white person got onto that streetcar and you were Caroline LeCount, a Black woman, or Octavius Cato, a Black man, or William Still, a Black businessman, even dealing with that camp, you were going to have to get off and then walk the rest of the distance. It wasn't quite, we call our Philadelphia's Rosa Parks, but I think the actual details are interesting too.
Or a little bit different, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's 90 years before what Rosa
Yeah.
Parks did. But the other comparison between her and Rosa Parks is that she wasn't a random person. She was not, like, we remember who they are, but we partly remember it because it was part of a larger organized effort involving a coalition of people to try to affect this change. And that's true with LeCount. That's true with Rosa Parks. LeCount, eventually the law does get changed, and the streetcar companies don't want the law to be changed, but Harrisburg changes the law. And this is a great reconstruction story. We often don't think of Reconstruction happening in the North, but these are Reconstruction civil rights movements in the North.
Right.
And
again, mentioning Octavius Cato, he's killed in the first election after the 15th Amendment.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, exactly. It's an example of what actually happened up here, even though obviously a lot was happening in the South too with Reconstruction. But LeCount actually asks to get on to the streetcar. The streetcar does not stop, and she forces the police to actually fine the conductor, or whatever you would call him, of it, goes to court and personally integrates the streetcar system. So that's what makes her Philadelphia's Rosa Parks, is that she actually gets the courts involved and she actually physically puts herself out there. There had been people, by the way, there who had been beat up trying to do the same thing, and it came at a great personal risk to do what she actually did.
You know,
Incredible.
gentlemen, it's kind of ironic that that Tony was a states' right person, which you could equate to local control, and it seems like more or less a local control issue where the will of the majority, wants the name change. It's ironic that the wheels of government grind so slowly.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, I think I looked at a website, Billy Penn, and they said this has been going on since 2017. And it's amazing how long it's taken to basically get his name off a street sign. Seems like a simple task, and I'm sure I looked at the list of people who were nominated to replace the name, because I read that one of the councilmen, I think it was Johnson, had wanted to know who we're going to name it after. And obviously, the steps have been taken to pick someone local. I mean, some of these are national figures too. I mean, I initially thought that, okay, if you picked Dred Scott, it would be a thumb in the eye, to that. But it makes so much sense the way you're explaining, the legacy of Caroline LeCount. And I never heard about Octavius Cato, so it's interesting to see.
I teach about him in my sports history class because he also is the captain of the first black baseball team in Philadelphia, the Pythians. So I tie that in my sports history class, Octavius Cato's story.
Leo, have you gotten any pushback from your employers, as a fellow Catholic school educator?
I not really. I haven't really talked about it too much in school. The one thing I have talked about in school recently was I had my students read an article about Octavius Cato, and I had them read a little bit of a primary source from a speech that Caroline LeCount gave, or from a statement that she made. And the one thing that I am really proud of that we did with this program is that Caroline LeCount died 100 years ago this January. So I went out to the cemetery in Eden Cemetery, which, if you are in Philadelphia and you're interested in Black history, it's a place that you need to go to. It's incredible, all the people that are buried there. And in 2007, they got Octavius Cato a really beautiful monument to mark where he's buried. But as of right now, there's no marker for Caroline LeCount. So starting in September, we fundraised for a marker for Caroline LeCount.
Wow.
And we just had a celebration last Saturday where we invited the donors, and she has no direct descendants, but we invited anybody I could find on ancestry.com that would be related to her. And we had different civic groups come, and the news actually covered it really briefly that we did actually secure the funding for a tombstone for her, and we are going to mark her grave out there.
Excellent.
So, that is one thing that I have talked about at school, just to say, that there are these opportunities out there to learn more about the rich history in Philadelphia. And I don't really see this as a controversial thing, to be honest, because I know that there's this narrative that there's I hate to say it, but the narrative is, let's say, the elephant in the room, that there's like a woke mob of leftists that are trying to rewrite American history or something. But that's not at all what's going on in the story. You've got the majority of people in Philadelphia actually want it to be changed. The majority of Philadelphians hated Roger Taney within a couple of years of the street being named after him. And then consistently afterwards either didn't even realize why it's named that way or didn't, think about it. But we're not seeing really any opposition. It's not like a community, it's not the sticky situation where you might be somewhere in the South or something like that, where there's like a Confederate soldier and there's an actual sizable amount of people. It's not at all analogous to that. So it is frustrating that it's not changed yet, because there's nothing going against us at this point. And I mean, obviously the problem with the Confederate monuments, of course, too, is that if you look closely, that's also what's happening in a lot of these areas. Like a lot of these areas, it's the local community saying, actually, we don't want that statue.
Right. I'm thinking specifically about Forest Park in Memphis, Tennessee, in the middle of an entirely African-American neighborhood. And they wanted to change the name
now,
from Nathan Bedford Forrest, the leader of the KKK.
And of course, I think he was actually in the park, wasn't he?
Is he buried there?
He was.
Oh, okay.
And they
moved him.
They moved him. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I believe Tennessee has a law that the state legislature, I could be wrong which state it is, but I think it's Tennessee, that the state legislature even took the power away from local municipalities for making decisions like that, which to your point, like that's the antithesis of democracy in my viewpoint. I don't understand how you can believe in democracy and not think that you can choose who you want to honor in your own community. You know, just because they did it in 1858 when they changed all those other street names doesn't mean we have to live like this forever. You know, we can choose to honor someone that actually changed our country and made a difference and somebody we want to live up to. We don't need to just keep our heads down and be like, oh, I guess a bunch of dead people.
That's that.
Yeah.
Leo, the problem is that people who want to ban books have never read many.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately.
Let me throw this general question out to all three of you, because it's something I talk about in my class. I'm sure to an extent you do also, Leo and Frank. Why does it matter who we honor with things like street names and statues? Like, does that matter? I'm just trying to play devil's advocate and just see what you all think. Like, why does it matter that the name Taney is on this street? Why does it matter that a statue of somebody is somewhere?
I think it
I
does
don't know
matter.
who wants to go first on that, but Frank.
Oh, all right. Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think it does matter because it shows you as a society who we revere. If we honor someone who is not really, who's done things that are really not so good, that means that we kind of find them to be acceptable. One of the arguments I always bring up is when I hear this, I get people who will argue with me, the old excuse that we're trying to erase history, which I always thought was kind of ludicrous.
Roger 20 won't exist anymore if we remove his name from the street, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So, my argument is there's no statues to Hitler, but we certainly know about him. So the idea that we're taking down statues is not, or taking names off streets is not erasing history at all. History is not street names. It's not statues. History, of course, is in what actually happened, the artifacts, books, things that, we associate with history, not statues and so on, unless statues themselves become history, like ancient Egypt or, Statue of Liberty, things like that, but statues themselves. So I've never been a big fan of the argument that removing Robert E. Lee from all these statues is erasing history. In fact, I think it's quite contrary that we should. I always found it strange that we had more statues of Robert E. Lee than Ulysses S. Grant, who actually won the war. But it's to me, I think it's important that we honor people who deserve to be honored.
Well, just to piggyback on what Frank said, I think it's about values and what you stand for. I asked that question to Leo, and I wasn't digging. I know that we at Hudson Catholic, we at times try to avoid politics. I think our employees would want us to do that, but there's an intersection between history and politics, and unfortunately, it does arise. But the way, Leo, you seem to be handling this is to provide education for letting kids make their own decisions, and I think that that's extremely important. It's an anathema, I guess, in Florida. You're lucky you're in Philadelphia.
We're all lucky we're not in Florida.
Yes, to God, that is the truth. It's a nice place to visit occasionally, but God, I would never want to live there, nor be an educator there, but so I think it does talk a lot about the people who live there and the values that they espouse. And I think that's why it's important. And you know what, that Tony's bust is now out of the Capitol and in the back offices somewhere in the old Supreme Court building is fine. He is a piece of history. And, you know, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. And it's kind of sad. But I do find this movement to classify this as a woke effort is like, you know, completely flies in the face of what we do in schools, what we do as educators.
Yeah, I mean, I teach a lot about racist history. I don't think anybody who knows me would classify me as a woke liberal.
No.
But Leo, you were going to just about to
Oh yeah, just one thing that, and this is also building, I think, a bit off what Frank said too, is that I've been lucky to go to Germany a number of times, and we actually have an exchange program with a German school. So I'm at an all boys school, and there's only a few all boys schools left in all of Europe, by the way, or at least all of Western Europe. And there's, I believe, only 3 all boys schools in Germany in the whole country. And we have an exchange program with one of them. And it's been a great program where their students come over here for a couple weeks and go to class, and then we take students over there for a couple weeks. And I've chaperoned a number of those trips, and I love doing those trips. And part of the reason why I love doing it is because I'm a nerd, and I get to go to all the battlefields, and I get to go to all the museums, and we take the students with us. And in my opinion, the Germans have figured out this problem, at least to an extent. I know there's a lot of nuance here, but when you go to a center that has to do with the Holocaust or has to do with the Nazi rule, then it's not called a museum. It's typically a documentation center. And the idea, they're very deliberate about this. And I think that they're onto something, which is, in general, I'm speaking generally here, but that you don't go to those places to honor the artifacts from those people like you might do in a museum. You know, a museum implies that you're going to go see a bunch of stuff like swords and uniforms maybe, or paintings, and then there's going to be something to honor about those artifacts. And they don't give that pedestal to the Nazis at all, but they want you to know what actually happened. And so they still want these documentation centers for you to go to see that. And then to Frank's point, of course, that's a big part of their history in the 20th century. There's no Adolf Hitler Boulevard. You know, there's absolutely no way that anyone could imagine making the argument, oh, well, that's our history and it's just going to erase our history if you don't rename that street. You know, those guys were obviously gangsters that named all of these things after themselves. And then overnight, none of it was named after them anymore. And the whole society figured out a way that I really think is commendable and we could learn something from as Americans. Imagine learning something from another country that you would say, you know, that's actually a way to deal with this. That's a way to make sure that your youth still knows about the history and that the society can still talk about what happened, but without actually honoring these people. And I think that's a direction we could really go in. And I think that is what's kind of happening in this country. I wish that there was a better understanding of that in general.
Yeah, I was actually in Berlin, and I was in the National History Museum. And there, of course, it's, because it was a national history, it had everything from like Charlemagne, onward, it seems. And they do have a room, with nationalist socialism. They had brown shirt uniforms, and there was an 88 millimeter gun that you could see it had been hit with a shell on the side of the barrel. But of course, that was abroad, the nationalist, the national museum. But and I've been to a couple of the concentration camps, and believe me, there's nothing there. That's another argument they bring up. Oh, so you want to erase this? So maybe we should, we have we still have memorials at the concentration camps. So what's wrong with the Confederate statues? I said, yes, but there's no statues to Himmler or Hitler in the concentration camps.
And nobody's having their weddings at Auschwitz. There's
no, they're not. Yeah.
There's no let's celebrate concentration camp culture like there is with plantation culture in South.
You know,
Yeah.
isn't it? My first visit to a concentration camp was my first visit to Germany in 1983, and I went to Dachau, and it was
Oh, yeah.
sweltering hot day. It's about, I guess, 6 miles outside of Munich,
Yeah.
and I was taken with every picture of Hitler. The face had been scratched out by people's nails. I mean,
Yeah.
the visceral effect that had. I was curious. I'd never been back to Dachau, but I often thought, you know, were they replaced, or what transpired with that? Any photograph of Nazis or Hitler were literally scratched out by the visitors at Dachau. You know, it's interesting. You know, getting back to Dred Scott, though, you know, don't you find it ironic that the guy's family owned a plantation that employed slaves, and when Roger Taney inherited it from his father, he freed his own slaves, yet he wasn't willing to en masse free slaves. Interesting. It was interesting. I mean, a big dichotomy.
Not only wasn't willing en masse to free slaves, he intentionally
Well,
made
dehumanized
statements in the
them.
Dred Scott case to say that nobody can en masse free
Yeah.
slaves.
And another important thing to remember, it wasn't like Taney was using past precedent to justify his decision, because there have been many cases before that where slaves had been brought to free territories and they received their freedom. I mean, it goes back to, I think there was some case in 1824 where somebody was living in Illinois or something and they received their freedom. And this was actually when Dred Scott and his wife, I think her name was Harriet.
Harriet,
Yeah, okay. Sued for their freedom. Everyone thought it was a slam dunk that they would just get their freedom because it had happened so many times earlier. I mean, it went to, and I was actually in the courtroom in St. Louis where the original Dred Scott decision was heard. I also visited the grave of Dred Scott, which is also just outside St. Louis. So there were many, many cases where this was considered, if you had gone to a free state, you received your freedom. And they just expected it. And then somehow it just didn't work that way. And it was more than a few lawsuits. I mean, I thought it was like, I remember originally thinking it was just like three, one court, Missouri Supreme Court, and then the United States Supreme Court. But apparently there was like numerous other trials in between. But eventually when it gets to the Supreme Court, Taney just kind of reversed previous precedent to make this decision. It wasn't something like, well, he was just, following precedent that had gone on. He actually went against it because so many former slaves had received their freedom once they traveled to a free state.
Right. This was his attempt to settle the slavery question that was tearing the country apart entirely in the pro-slavery direction, and say, okay, we're done. We did it. This question is solved and settled.
That was his hope.
In fact, he ignored precedent so much that he said, for over 100 years, even before the Constitution, Black people were treated and seen as inferior in this country. And he uses that as his legal logic, which is not legal logic.
Right.
That's anecdotal. But it's not even true, because even in some southern states, North Carolina, for example, Black people even had the right to vote if they owned property up until a certain point in American history. So he just completely ignores the reality of the situation in the past.
Right.
Leo, I want to throw to you one last, because I don't want to keep you too long on a Sunday morning. It's not next Sunday where you're going to be very busy, I know, as a Philadelphia
that's right.
person.
Go Birds. Go Birds.
There is another Philadelphian that I know you're very interested in that probably doesn't get the credit they deserve in history, and that's George Meade.
Oh, yeah.
Just give you a moment to talk about George Meade.
Well, I wanted to, let me give a shout out to the George Meade Society, which also donated some money for that tombstone for Caroline LeCount, and they were really excited to hear about this. There's a group of historical activists really in Philadelphia that try to keep the name of George Meade alive, and every New Year's Eve, which is his birthday, December 31st, they have a 21 gun salute and present wreaths at his gravesite at Laurel Hill Cemetery, which is probably our most historic cemetery. So, I'm a big General Meade fan. Of course,
people out there who might not know, General Meade took over the command of the Union Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, led it through the Battle of Gettysburg to victory, and led the army for the rest of the war. That often gets forgotten. We think of Grant coming east and takes command of the army, but he doesn't really. George Meade is the commander of the Army of the Potomac for the remainder of the Civil War. And yet things happen. He's not even present at Appomattox. There's 50 people in the room with General Grant at Appomattox. George Meade is not one of them. And he gets very overlooked. And why do we not have more memory of George Meade? He beat Robert E. Lee, going back to what Frank said about Ulysses S. Grant earlier. He was the first one to really beat Robert E. Lee.
It's an annoying cultural thing, too, is that we have this absolutely beautiful equestrian statue of George Meade, which is out hidden in Fairmount Park behind Memorial Hall. And it would have been, I guess, something that people noticed more like back when the Centennial was out there. But now it's just by this like city pool and nobody really knows who this guy is on a horse. And then, much to our chagrin, there's this beautiful equestrian statue of George McClellan, who was also born in Philadelphia, outside of our city hall.
You couldn't hear that on the audio. Frank just audibly groaned, because we've talked about George McClellan before on this podcast, who we elected governor here in New Jersey.
So this group wanted to move them. They wanted to move the Meade statue. And by the way, to be totally badass, I hope I can say that word on your podcast. But they that statue of George Meade is made from melted down Confederate cannons. Exactly.
Nice touch.
But they wanted to move him to City Hall, and there's just the money and the whole, like, as you can see, it's hard to get the street renamed. So getting that to happen, I think, was a bridge too far, for at least for now.
Well, you mentioned William Still earlier, who kept the records of the Underground Railroad and people successfully fleeing to freedom. There is a William Still and George Meade connection here in New Jersey, which is George Meade was the chief engineer building the Cape May Lighthouse before the Civil War. And William Still, a number of times in his records, talks about people fleeing, especially the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware, that light from the lighthouse was assigned to them, that they were coming up to the land of freedom, to the north. So George Meade is one who built that lighthouse that William Still mentions a number of times in his records.
There is something that's strange about the politics of people that are Civil War nerds like us, which is that I think a lot of them are very quick to dismiss the Union commanders that are not even Ulysses S. Grant, like saying a second ago, like there's this very strange, I guess it's a lost
the ones
cause.
That weren't prominently featured by the movie Gettysburg.
Or like the Shelby.
Suddenly Chamberlain won the Civil War. And
exactly.
What's George Meade's role in the whole 4.5 hour movie of Gettysburg? Is he shows up in the dark and says, "Is this a good place to fight?"
Yeah.
I hope it is. And that's his whole role in a 4.5 hour movie.
It's crazy to me that that's what we picked up, because obviously there was so much politics going on in the Army of the Potomac. I mean, they were fighting, everyone who was an officer in the Army of the Potomac wasn't just fighting Confederates, they were also fighting each other. And I think that it's a shame, because the nerds have divided and only talked about the military history stuff and the pop culture of who was actually good or bad. And I feel like they've overlooked a lot of people that made real sacrifices for our country, like George Meade. And George Meade didn't have to go enlist at all. George Meade was grievously injured during the war, was shot, and didn't have to return.
During the 7 days, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and then he died young, which almost certainly was a direct result of the injuries that he had in the Civil War. So, I mean, he survived the war, but the guy really did sacrifice for the country, didn't really had a silver spoon. He didn't have to do that. He also, I think, gets a bad rap for strategy in general and what he was actually trying to do. I know that the one George Meade controversy that I'd like to look more into is exactly what happened at the crater, because oftentimes he gets blamed. Which I don't know all the details. I feel like
I've read about it, and I was at the crater, and they don't really know. Meade is kind of given, like he knew, he was the one who had the original plan that was changed, politically changed above him. So Meade, I think Meade, and I agree with you that Meade does get the short end of the stick.
At that point, he had a very awkward relationship with Ambrose Burnside, who was commanding the Ninth Corps, because Burnside technically outranked him due to seniority.
But also to get back to, you're actually correct about the Civil War nerds. I had a man I knew who was a real Civil War historian. His son was a reenactor. They used to go to all these reenactments. His wife was involved, and he just had nothing good to say about Meade. And some of the things he actually said, I looked into it and we're totally even wrong. It was just like there's this rumor about Meade, and by the way, as a Philadelphian myself, I was actually born there.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I left when I was 5 though, or 4. But
an opposite of a Ben Franklin.
Yeah,
he went to Boston.
Well, yeah. The more I read about Meade, and I realize that he doesn't get anywhere near the credit he deserves. He's like the
Rodney Dangerfield.
Yeah, I was thinking the Longstreet of the North, but of course that's a different situation where Longstreet doesn't get any credit because they're trying to destroy his reputation since he became a Republican and spoke out against the lost cause whole thing. But Meade, I don't know why Meade. I guess it's why do you think Meade is just
coming back to what
maybe Joe's right
coming
about
back a little bit to what Leo said, that all of us Civil War nerds, even those who root for the North, which seems to be a minority of Civil War nerds. That we dismiss what the Northern generals did.
Right,
if the Northern Union wins a battle, we say it's because the South messed up, because that Braxton Bragg was a bad general, that this happened or that happened. But if the South wins the battle, we talk about the brilliance of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. In a way, we kind of buy into the lost cause narrative that the North winning things is only because they have more men or anything.
Right. I don't
completely dismiss the personalities of the North that led them to victory.
Yeah, I think there's a reason for that. I think that I honestly believe that the Confederate generals, have more skin in the game. Look what they did with their careers. They hitched it on the Confederacy, plain and simple. And even though, if you look at it from a purely objective point of view, they had everything going against them. But the truth of the matter is, sadly, that the intersection of politics and the military, led to too many incompetent, strategists regarding the Union generals. Sometimes I think it's amazing that the Union actually won the war, in spite of itself. Fortunately, Wright won out. I mean,
well, here in New Jersey, we have our own who is not getting the respect, in my opinion, going back to monuments, Phil Kearny. Phil Kearny is, like you said about George Meade, he had no reason he had to get involved in the Civil War. He was actually overseas at the time. He was a very wealthy man. He was from a millionaire family, but came and joined the Union cause and fought very well early in the war. He was a very celebrated soldier and wound up getting killed just after the Battle of Second Manassas.
Yeah.
His statue is one of the 2 that New Jersey has currently in Statuary Hall in the Capitol building. It's currently scheduled to be removed to replace it with Alice Paul. And there's nothing wrong with putting a statue of Alice Paul. That's not my complaint. But there is an element where it seems to be dishonoring Kearny to have him be the one removed to put Alice Paul in. And people are going to see it as, this is what I'm worried about, it's another Civil War general we're tearing down a statue of. And it's not somebody who had any kind of problematic element to his record. But, Richard Stockton is our other statue. He could be removed. Yeah. He was the one signer of the Declaration of Independence who reneged on the Declaration of Independence by the end of the Revolutionary War and said, I take it back. We're keeping him and we're taking out Phil Kearny.
One other person, a New Jerseyan by the name of John McLean. He was the other dissenter on the Dred Scott case.
Oh.
I looked it up.
There you go. Did not know
John
that.
McLean, born in Morris County. He did move. I think he was in Ohio or something when he eventually,
Yeah, that makes more sense.
one of the many, he was like,
He wasn't
like-
in McClellan country anymore.
no,
All right, we
no,
are coming up on our hour. I know this is a Sunday morning. I woke you up early, all of you, to
I've
take
been
part
up
in this.
far.
But I want to go around and just kind of get everybody's last thoughts on any of the topics that we talked about, whether it's the Roger Taney issue, George Meade, or anybody else that we've talked about. What are people's last thoughts? Bill, I'll go to you first, and we'll go around.
Well, I have to say, I just want to commend Leo. I think he's doing great work in terms of Tony and getting that street renamed, and also educating the kids in his high school with regard to this and other civic issues. I think that's something that's somewhat lacking, in the teaching of history. I'm not going to say at either of our schools, but kids do not learn civics to a certain degree and how history influences it. And they need to do that because there's a void when it comes to their consciousness with regard to this.
Oh, thank you very much.
Frank, your last thoughts?
All right. Let's take down the statues of Tawny and rename the streets, and let's put up George Meade statues and rename Tawny Street to Meade Street. I'm all for that. I think
Is there a Main Street in Philadelphia?
I don't think there is, actually. I mean, there is a marker, there's a statue, but I don't recall there being a Meade Street.
I'm not sure if we have one in Jersey City either, because we have a lot of streets named for generals.
You know what? Yeah, there's no.
Even Henry Halleck has a street named after him that I take every day to get.
Oh my God! Well, he's the one that actually won the Civil War, Joe. That's the book.
Anybody listening out there, there's an inside joke that Leo, me, and my other friend Chris have, that we're going to write a book about Henry Halleck, how he really was the genius of the Civil War.
There's a Meade Street in West Orange.
Okay, there we go. I wonder if it's
I don't know if that's, but I would. Yeah, the city of Orange and West Orange does have a Meade. I think it all depends on when the streets were. Like, I always laugh.
Well, I talk about that with monuments too, even Confederate monuments. When did they go up? I think that
right. I always laugh. Like, we see a lot of one of our coworkers, Jim Falconer, has sons who go to a school in Kinnelon named after Warren G. Harding. Probably one of our, if not our, well, I wouldn't say our worst president. I saved that for Andrew
Bottom
Johnson.
5.
But he's bad because he did nothing and didn't want to do anything. He just was lucky that, there was no Civil War pending.
Well, he's lucky that he died before all the scandals came out about him.
Frank, there's a Harding Township too. I mean, I don't know, that's it's in Morris County. I'm not sure if that's named after Warren Harding. I don't know.
Oh, no, it is. Oh,
it is?
Okay. It's actually the Warren Harding School. It's because if you look at it, you see when the school was built was 1920. Harding was president. A lot of grammar schools, there's one here in Bayonne named after Woodrow Wilson. It was built in 1918. A lot of grammar schools, public grammar schools, were built in the early 1900s. So a lot of them got the names of the current president, either Wilson, Harding, to it. So it was kind of interesting. That's probably part of the reason why you have these is when the school was built.
Yeah.
Or streets were put down. Jersey City, most of the streets were pretty much done before the Civil War. So there were a lot of them, Green Street, Gates Avenue, Washington Street, were all named after Revolutionary War generals.
Right. Montgomery Street goes right by our school for this first.
And we're actually between, which I would think our school is between Montgomery Street and Warren Street, two American Revolutionary generals who died in the war. So, and then we have Torr Street behind us, who is named after,
who owned the home there at the time of the Revolutionary War. So.
Yeah, she was, she's considered a heroine, but she really didn't do anything. Or did very, very little. But there's a street named after. That's cool. So we're actually on 3 sides. We have streets named after Revolutionary War people.
And Baron DeKalb Street is just a block away.
Yes.
You go down the hill. So another one who died in the war. Leo, your last thoughts. First of all, thank you for coming on Wigs for Wigs. We might have to have you on again to talk about Civil War nerddom.
I'd love to. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. If you want to talk any Civil War debate, I'd love to do that. I have a direct quote from Caroline LeCount in 1873, and she was still arguing. She was seemingly a very feisty lady and someone that was always looking to further civil rights in the United States. And I love this quote because in 2 sentences, I think she encapsulates what her main perspective was. And she said, "To be intelligent is to understand the laws of the land, and the great feature of our laws is that they make no distinction by reason of color. To produce so grand a result, which the truly intelligent can comprehend, has cost our nation thousands of lives and millions of money, and we laugh to scorn this attempt to repudiate the sacrifices and sufferings of true Americans." And I think that was from 1873. I think that says everything about an educator's perspective, a Black woman's perspective in the North, a Reconstruction perspective about what the Civil War was actually about. It was to declare that this country is a place of equality. It was to declare that race should not make you a second-class citizen, and that everyone is a citizen in the United States. And it also emphasizes the importance of education. And as someone that educated thousands of students, I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind for Caroline LeCount. So yeah, thank you for having me on.
Amen.
I think that's a great way for us to end, is with that quote from Caroline LeCount and your little summary of it. So thank you again so much, Leo and Bill and Frank, for coming on today, waking up early on a Sunday morning to do this. Audience out there, as always, we can be reached with your thoughts. If you have any questions for any of us, or just follow-up thoughts on these topics we've talked about, we can be reached, as always, at Wigs for Wigs. That is WIGSFORWHIGS@gmail.com. We always love to hear from you. We could share your thoughts on a future episode. Maybe Leo will come back if we can arrange it. And we'll see you again very soon on another episode here of Wigs for Wigs. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.